I think the presentations we've heard this morning, if I can just set the scene before we have the discussion, we've saw particularly impact from the macro perspective from Credit Suisse, but the crisis itself is threefold, and I think it's critically important when we direct our conversation today to think in those three areas. The first portion of the crisis is how long the crisis is likely to be around in the South African context. And that's purely a function really of how quickly Eskom can bring either Medupi and Concealia online or turn around its plant performance. And we've seen optimistic estimates from 18 months, pessimistic from 5 years to 7 years, but I think the consensus is that between 5 and 6 years is the period this energy crisis is likely to address. The second issue that we're facing is obviously severity. How are people experiencing the electricity crisis on a daily basis? And really that is related to current plant performance and the ability of Eskom to directly affect its post-maintenance plant performance. If we look at the latest statistics, we see plant availability sitting probably at around 72%, and the trajectory remains on a downward spiral. So the severity of load curtailment, the severity of load shedding that we're going to be experiencing on a daily basis is likely to continue and grow, particularly until such time as maintenance issues are addressed. And the final one, which is obviously most topical, is the issue of the price impact. One from Eskom addressing its emergency measures, the price impact that we saw at the application that was recently declined. And the second one, obviously, that Mike raised earlier this morning is this issue of declining demand. Lack of sales from Eskom due to, one, their plant performance, and two, the demand is the country as a whole. So while we saw some of the presentations today, I think the purpose of today's discussion with our panel members is to talk about how mines themselves are experiencing some of those issues, addressing some of those issues from the short, medium, and long term, and what they're likely to be doing in the future to mitigate that. So a couple of questions I'm going to be talking to the panel members and asking them to give their perspective. Maxwell, what do you think that the impact on load shedding in the mining business has been, and how's that going to affect your planning into the future?
Okay, I mean, from our mines, what we see is that we have basically interest in Tronox, which is a much more heavy mineral, and we also have coal mines, and most of our coal mines are tied up to Eskom, so we don't see much of the load shedding. But we also, like in our mines, there are some mines that have got commercial and supply, and there we see into load shedding. But we also participate in the demand into site management, which means that we actually should, like, we actually bring those mines into the plant down, when Eskom requires us to load shed, like to actually assist them. And but on the other side, if you look at productivity, we are affected into productivity-wise. If you look at why I say productivity-wise as well, even in those tied-up mines, you find that there's a social aspect of our labor force as well. And if you look at the social aspect of our labor force, is the guys, when they get home, they get affected, and they don't sleep in time, and then they have to come back to the mine, and they're not so productive. I mean, there's also an element of safety as well that comes into the whole aspect. And in terms of our growth as well is affected because there's a lack of investment in the mining space at the moment. You don't get into investors willing to actually participate in the mining in South Africa because of load shedding as well. So from that aspect, we are still heavily affected.
You raise an interesting point there, and wonder if you want to talk about it. The issue that load shedding is having on the safety culture, both as from an organization's productivity and daily operations, but also from a staff perspective.
Thank you, Shaun, and good evening, good morning, everybody. Good conference. From safety perspective, Shaun, what we're seeing in the industry is that, especially when you talk to underground mines, I mean, most of the mines, especially existing operations, are connected to the grid. You have a massive consumption of electricity for our ventilation systems. So if you were to be load shedded, I mean, we've got mines that have over 2,000 employees underground. So you're sitting with a safety issue where employees can lose lives if people were to, load shedding were to happen unannounced. I think thanks to Eskom and the relationship it's building with the industry, if it were to happen, you get advance warning. But also, I mean, it increased the cost of doing mining. I mean, the mine that I work for, we have to spend 40 million buying 9 gensets. And I mean, I was doing calcs recently. With 40 million, I could support 10 of my lowest category employees for 30 years. I mean, it's a high cost. So you have the safety feature in terms of ventilation. There's also an operational issue that I can touch with just to support my colleague. I mean, the delay, if Eskom says I'm going to load shed for 4 hours, the impact can last up to 7 days in some of the operation, depending on what type of operation you are. Especially if you're talking to plants, you know, your ore processing plants. Most people will tell you, a processing plant, you don't stop. If you stop that processing plant, for it to operating optimally, it takes 24 hours, most of them to start, whether it's a smelter or whatever. It takes 7 days, or some of them 3 to 7 days before it runs optimally again. So a 4-hour or a 1-hour interruption can cost the mine actually in terms of efficiency, in terms of running that plant efficiently. It can, the downstream costs are quite significant.
Funani, what are the fundamental differences that you're seeing, you know, from last year to this year, from the electricity crisis and shortage perspective? Are you seeing an increase in load curtailment? Are you seeing an increase in shedding directly, more stage 2?
Shaun, I was saying to my colleagues yesterday that maybe I should move to either Polokwane or it's mainly Polokwane. We've got 2 mines in Tabazimbi and 1 in Begersford. Strange enough, we haven't experienced load shedding in those areas. The guys in Polokwane are probably doing something that we don't know. However, our mines in the Gauteng area, our operations, as well as in the Western Cape, we've seen an increase in load shedding, to the extent that last year we lost on average 3% of production time. We now, year to date, seeing close to 5%, which is quite significant. Luckily, our Western Cape operation is a bentonite operation, which is suffering like most other operations in terms of demand. We can cope with such issues. I think the biggest issue is what he just mentioned, is once you shut down the plant, it's chaos, not only from a startup point of view, but also, you know, you just create all sorts of problems, spillages, safety is an issue. And as a result, the morale of the staff just goes down. And to get it up, it's a huge effort.
Mike, given your position as probably the government spokesperson on this bench today.
No, please.
No, joke. Does the War Room, do you think, understand the severity of the crisis and its impact on both the economy and the mining industry?
Maybe just so, because my day job is a solar PV developer, but I also have an evening job as well, which I represent the renewable energy industry under the Booster Energy Task Team into the War Room, and I'm also one of the councillors of the Ministerial Advisory Council for Energy. So I'm schizophrenic. I have to advise the minister, and I'm also dealing with business, so I get confused at times. I think what your question was. Sorry, just.
Do you think the War Room appreciates the impact of the crisis?
I would say it's crystallised out. I would say over the last 6 months that load shedding is one of the most destructive aspects for the economy. I think the question is, plans have all been put together. The issue is, as we all know in this country, implementation is a massive challenge. We know the cost of it. I think one of the things about renewable energy, I think a number of you would have seen the CSIR analysis that was done in terms of the savings to the economy from a load shedding perspective and from a diesel saving perspective of having just 1,300 megawatts built during 2014. As the price comes down of renewable energy and as load shedding increases, that number is likely to become more and more significant. So yes, I think we appreciate it. We appreciate it from a business side, and I think from a war room side, getting government to actually implement, and we're starting to see that happening, as you can see the IPP processes that have been announced, the expedited extra round of 1,800 megawatts of renewables that will happen in September, the coal process. But clearly the other side of that, you see delays in terms of the gas procurement process. Cogen has changed and it's become somewhat probably hopefully is not as effective in the short term as it should be. But yes, we do. I think unfortunately, as I said, in an election year, you'd never want to say we have a crisis. Okay, so I think it's a problem sometimes of getting the, let's call it, appropriate speed of action, okay, from governments on things like that. But they are moving, albeit too slowly.
Thanks, Mike. Wanda, do you think the way in which mines are now planning expansion or current operations has fundamentally changed since to 2014, when the crisis really hit us hard? And what are some of those changes in planning and outlook that have taken place?
I do believe it has changed. Obviously, the cost of capital is increasing because immediately you're planning to set up a mine, suddenly you have to start now, whether you're looking for an IDP to come on board, you have to now have either, whether you're going for yourself or bringing an IDP, you have to now sort of have additional cost of capital, which unfortunately, I mean, the low commodity prices cycle where we're in, I mean, Justin alluded to that, it's not actually bearing very well for the industry. So you go to, I mean, some of the lenders are here, you talk to a lender today at this boom, this cycle, I mean, it's a very bad time to raise capital. So obviously, in 2014, price is an issue. But I mean, obviously, Eskom, the investor sentiments, once again, Justin has alluded to that. It has changed, definitely, looking at all these issues, including, obviously, the issue of power.
Maxwell, we know Exxaro has obviously got a spin-off from an energy and an IPP producer, but are you looking to, as Sibanye Gold said in the nurse presentations, that they're looking to ways in which they can fundamentally make themselves independent of Eskom? To what degree do you think your organisation is doing, and how do you think other organisations are doing?
Hello? Okay. You can't, at the moment, it's not easy to be totally independent of Eskom. We still have to do, we are still dependent on Eskom in many ways. If you look at renewable energy, it won't give you all the benefits because you still need a base and supply actually during those times, for example, when you don't have wind, you still need a secret of supplies through Eskom. But if you look at what we're doing at the moment as Exxaro, we're actually exploring other avenues, and as you know, we're already in wind business as an IPP, and we're also looking at our waste as an example, to look at our waste and say, can we use our waste to produce and to power for ourselves, and either partner with renewable energy suppliers to come and supply us through our own waste, and also look at other IPP like into coal-based as well, where we are looking at putting up a power station like through other ventures, or maybe into supply coal to to someone else to supply us power. So we are looking at all these avenues, but that's not our primary focus to supply ourselves. Is to actually assist the country to actually to have a security of supply from both renewable and also from the coal-based power stations.
Shaun, we in industrial minerals, and generally industrial minerals operations are very small. We've looked at a number of options. For example, in Zimbabwe, we do operate some parts of our plant with a genset. But if you were to run 50% of the time with a genset, you wipe out your margins, and it is the case here in South Africa. Solar, where we challenged when we do investigations, is you need massive pieces of land, and a lot of our mines are leased from farmers. For you to lease extra space and put in that capital, it just kills it. At this point, we're surviving, and we're saying, while Eskom is making an effort in communicating, we'll use the time for other valuable activities. And of course, if the grid were to collapse completely, then it changes the picture. And of course, the pricing does play a role.
Mike, one of the things I've heard in the passage and mentioned several times is one of the challenges that IPPs have, particularly around access to grid and wheeling charges. Are those some of the things that are being discussed, and what's your experience?
Actually, the reason I was late coming into the room was I was on the phone to Eskom about trying to deal with cost estimate letters and grid connection. I think it's been impressed on Eskom, particularly, over the last 6 months, about the fact that there isn't enough transparent information given to developers about the, let's call it the capacity to connect onto the grid. As you will know, it's I guess the historic view was build in the Northern Cape. That is starting to change, and the market is starting to move east. On the issue of wheeling, it's a long and contentious issue. I also am the vice chair of the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association, and we, along with SAWIA, the Wind Association, and other IPP members, now sit on a committee with NERSA to try and unravel this wheeling charge issue. Again, the issue is about whether we are moving at an appropriate pace. When you speak to NERSA and Zwane, he's very keen for it to happen. Unfortunately, we tend to have, on most of these issues, an elephant in the room. I think you know it's a 5-letter word, beginning with E, which tends to slow processes down. But it is something that will, I think, as the crisis unfolds and things become, I think, let's call it, the necessity to move quicker will happen as we move forward. Unfortunately, it would be nice to be more proactive about the way we do things. That just tends not to be the way in South Africa. But I think the wheeling issue will be dealt with over the next year. I think grid is being dealt with right now, and I think if you, for all developers, if you go to the Eskom website and look at the new GCCA 2022, it's a much more interactive map, and it gives you far more transparent information about how to connect to the grid. As you'll see from what they're trying to do also through the procurement process is to try and attract projects now that can connect quicker. Okay, and so the unfortunate problem we have with renewables is we're very fast to adopt, but the process isn't actually allowing us to use that virtue at the moment. But I think those things are being adjusted, and I say there will be a change to the RFP next year. And I think we'll take some of the lessons that we've learnt over the last 3 years.
Wonder the threat of increasing prices. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've seen the electricity price double. We have a threat of carbon tax coming in. We expect further increases in the tariff from emergency use of diesel and obviously declining demand. What are mines doing to try and mitigate that and extend the life of the mining operations that do already have?
Shaun, I think after the Marikana issue and many of the labor issues that you're seeing, the cost of all the inputs, diesel, everything else. Mines are looking for mechanization, more increased mechanization to try and cut one of the highest cost in a mine, which can range between even 45 and 60%, depending on the type of mine you are, it's labor cost. So if you look at one lever you can control as a mine, you try and say, how do I make, I think most of the presenters spoke about productivity. How do we make the labor productive? Engage the unions to say, how do we address issues of productivity? Productivity as hasn't engaged the mines as effectively as it should. Generally in the country, we need to increase education, increase productivity, and mines has to look at ways to make labor more productive, cut labor costs where they can. I know the unions would shoot us if they hear that, but we do need to look at the cost drivers in our business and negotiate more long-term arrangements with suppliers, and use single sourcing where you go for one suppliers, syndicate if you have to, and use maybe less suppliers to try and drive down costs. But I think there's a high degree needed for syndication in the mine in various areas, whether it's producing, talking to IPPs or whatever. We need to come up together, and we are facing the same giant. For us to operate as single mines and try to drive things that we commonly face, it's no longer wise. I think mines in same regions need to come together and face whatever challenges they face together, whether it's issues of community unrest, it's issues of cost inputs that are high. We need to syndicate better as an industry. Thank you.
Just to come in on that one, Shaun, we have a very comprehensive efficiency program that we run within Exxaro, and we've already seen huge savings and within our organization, and we are already putting some solar panels on top of the buildings, and some of our labor force into residentials. We've already to look at renewables. We've already designed those properties and put them in such a way that we can actually save energy, and so we're progressing in that front, and we've seen huge improvement. One other thing that we're focusing on is operation behavior of the people, to know when to actually switch on the plant and when to operate it. Stop operating the plant when it's you don't have full capacity to operate the plant. For example, you take the conveyor as an example. When do you run the conveyor as an example? You can't run the conveyor when it's empty, as an example. You need to have full load onto the conveyor. So those behaviors, and we are looking at the behavior and changing the behavior of our own workforce as well, and also focus on productivity, as my colleague has said as well. So that's actually very close at the moment.
We also, as a global company, we've got efficiency programs. One, of course, on the energy side, that's very tricky. The most important thing is to know when to start and stop, especially during peak times. But more importantly is to run your plants efficiently and make sure that at every time the machines are turning, you're producing. We do use other energy sources, for example, heating. We're looking at various supplementary materials, and unfortunately in some cases we replace coal, bring in some alternatives just to drive down costs. Unfortunately, the easiest cost to cut out when things are really tough is your labor force. So you're forced to restructure, you're forced to do things differently, which is sad because we shouldn't be in this situation. And as we carry on, as Eskom's challenges and the prices go up, we will keep digging deep. There's always a margin somewhere to squeeze.
Just a last question before I'll take some questions from the audience. How do you see the energy mix changing, given that Eskom's prices are rising so quickly that it's making various other technologies a lot more reasonable and viable?
Well, I think it was one of the important things that Mike came up with this morning. I mean, I think we've asked for it a number of times. Until you start having some kind of future tariff path, okay, for Eskom power, it's very difficult for anyone out there to start making, I would say, kind of informed decisions about what alternative power they should be using. Okay, it's an important thing to do. I think the problem right now is, let's say you saw the 25% increase pushback by NERSA. The reality of it is that is going to appear somewhere in the mix down the line, and everyone's going to have to pay for it. So when I hear people saying I benchmark against Eskom pricing about whether I make a decision to do a wind farm or solar or biogas or whatever, I do have to ask them, what benchmark price are you using on Eskom over the next 5 to 10 years on which you're basing that decision? I do think one of the things of, like, say, the war process, and I would say from your day job at the EIUG, was that one of the learning curves over the last 6 months was to realise that our energy crisis was not a Medupi-Kusile issue. It is actually a systemic issue, okay? And therefore it is an issue that we can't, it's not about let's just wait it out for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, depending on who you want to believe in respect of those two plants being commissioned. And it's not a silver bullet issue. There's no one issue is not going to solve the problem here. Okay, it's about having fundamentally a number. And when you hear the energy efficiency, it's about getting very serious on energy efficiency in South Africa. It's about having a proper IRP. Okay, it's about actually having a number of initiatives going on at the same time to solve this issue. Okay, it's at the moment, I think if people say once Medupi and Kusile is done, it's all over, then I really do think you're a danger to your business if that's the path you're using. And it is about having plan B and probably having plan C at the same time. So, as I say, maybe I'm putting my PV developer's hat on here, so take it from whence it comes. Ultimately, people have to start bringing alternative energy solutions in. The question must be, is ultimately, what kind of scenario plan do you have to where electricity prices are going to go? Okay, if you're being load shed and you're finding your production's dropping, what is your actual cost of electricity? Because it's not the Eskom tariff, that's for sure. Okay, add in your loss of production. Okay, so I think people have to start doing some very serious work on this. About, as I say, mining's not going to go away. And I think the other bit that concerns probably me more than anything that I see is that we are struggling to meet production levels, okay, at the low point of the commodity cycle. Okay, the question will be is when we have the next commodity boom, will this country miss out on it again? Okay, because it's not set up and it doesn't have the electricity to actually participate in that boom. And that's again a real problem for this country, I think, going forward. Okay.
We have 5 more minutes before lunch. Maybe if I can ask if there's anyone from the floor who has any questions, I'll take a few questions and then we can wrap up.
Thanks. My question is addressed to Mike, relating to your last comment, Mr. Chairman, about being a danger to your company if you think that's going to be the end of it after Kusile. I fully agree with you. And I asked this question I'd rather not say where I asked it, but I asked it to a couple of Eskom people many years ago, probably about 5 years ago. I said to them, Medupi's in the pipeline, Kusile is in the pipeline, and that's not going to be the end of it. Because we've got aging power stations that will need to be replaced. We have to start, Medupi and Kusile will probably just make provision for the lack of maintenance that's being done now. What about the growth, as you just said, because we have to make ready for the next boom. And I asked them the question, I said, what about replacing the old power stations? And their answer to me was, you're still young, you'll have to worry about it. We old, we don't have to worry about it. So maybe more a comment than a question, but you can maybe take that to the war room and just make them aware of it as well, that the end of Kusile is not going to be the end of it.
Take your comments on board.
And I think there's a lot of perspective in the country around this issue of a massive nuclear build. Right? To what degree do you think that renewable energies can delay the requirement for the nuclear build?
Are you asking me the question or the listen, I think we have an IRP, and the IRP has a number of different technologies within it. I would say, and this is my personal view, if you look at when we did the renewable energy IPP process, when you look at the coal process, when you look at the cogen process, we have all been given price caps for the technology, which we say that above that price there are better alternatives for us to build baseload. I see no reason why. I have no fundamental objection to nuclear. Okay, it's just got to make sure it's the best solution for this country. Okay, within our energy mix. Again, people shouldn't look for silver bullets to solve our issue. It's having everything participating.
Ian Curry here. Firstly, thanks very much to the panel and the chairman for this discussion. I think it's been very valuable. And I just want to remind everyone what Maxwell said about how important it is for all of us as South Africans to remain connected to the national grid. The grid is probably one of the most valuable assets that South Africa has. And that is a fundamental role that Eskom has to play in the future of power generation and more about power delivery in this country, is having the national grid and making sure that that asset is properly maintained, expanded, not only from a South African perspective, but from a regional perspective as well, because that's where the potential lies. You can buy power from independent power producers, and yes, I am an independent power producer, so as Mark has said a couple of times, take it from whence it comes. But the IPP program and the renewable energy program has shown that independent power producers or the private sector working in conjunction with Eskom are far more effective at being able to deliver power quickly, on time, and within cost and within budget. And if you look at the performance of the independent power producer plants, many of them, if not all of them, are performing at or exceeding their projections in terms of power delivery and price. What we mustn't lose sight of is how important the national grid is to enable Eskom to supply power to the consumers, like the mines. And people that are thinking about becoming independent from Eskom, as in going off-grid, is probably one of the worst things that could happen to the South African economy as a whole. Because if you look at the population spread and if you look at the industries that we are so desperately needing for economic growth, we do need the grid. So I just warn everyone and raise a flag. Please don't think about leaving the grid entirely. Remain connected, because there will be times where you need it, and there will be times when you can provide power into that grid. And I think that's what the regulator really needs to be looking at, is how does it embrace multiple suppliers, and Eskom focuses on the supply and delivery of electricity to consumers as and when it's required, at the right price, and reliably, and at the right quality.
Brilliant, thank you.
Add on that, I think the discussion should research around how efficient is Eskom and how effective we actually execute our IRP, as Mike was saying, and also not to lose sight that we actually need the mix of different types of energy, and we need to manage that so that into this country can stabilize, because without it, without that mix, we won't be able to sustain our growth and to aspirations as a country.
My comment, Shaun, on this is that it's important to keep Eskom alive. we need also to caution as well the IPPs that also a regulatory environment is important to regulate one prices. Currently, because it's clustered and not actually being brought together in one sort of forum, the prices in itself, it's also not very attractive in terms of now the alternative to Eskom. Whether you're talking wind, solar, or whatever, it's not very attractive. So to keep our country, I mean, you've seen the projection that one of the graphs with the early morning session was pointing. I mean, we are very expensive. Power is very expensive in the country, and it's not good for business. It's not good for any development of a country. So we need to keep the price of power down. So IPPs have a power to play, Eskom has a power to play, government has a power to play, industry has a power to play to bring the prices down. It's very important for business. Thank you.
I agree. We need Eskom. We need the grid. I think the biggest issue that we now all know is the availability of the existing infrastructure. And I keep wondering why Eskom is battling alone when it's got expertise of private sector, engineers and maintenance specialists and procurement people, and it's not mobilizing those for assistance. I think we can do things a lot quicker than the 18 months we're talking about.
Mike, I don't know if you have a final word before I wrap up. And another question.
Just a quick one. Kevin Minko from NON. Somebody mentioned an interesting point about syndicating mines in order to be able to talk to IPPs, and that sounds like a very good idea and something that the EIUG might be looking into. So Shaun, I don't know if that's something that EIUG has been working on to create a power purchasing group, or even in itself to become a trading platform that could sign PPAs and then resell power to the power users.
It is something that has obviously been discussed through various entities to create it, but particularly around funding the nuclear environment, so that large companies can provide upfront capital to guarantee low prices going forward. The challenge we obviously have in South Africa is issues related to competition commission, which is significantly holding back some of those joint parties to PPAs. But it is something that would have to be looked at in the future, where you create purchasing pools to finance particularly big investments. So it is something. There are a number of hurdles to it, but it is something that a lot more companies are considering.
Just a comment, really. I hear a lot of protectionism going on. I'm a Brit, so I apologise for that in this South African discussion. I hear a lot of sentiment towards Eskom and trying to get Eskom to a point of understanding the issues that miners are facing, but I see some very senior miners on the board here, or sitting here in the discussion, and whilst you don't want to put in an IPP solution that is more expensive than Eskom, you mustn't lose sight of the fact that, so let me give you an example. A 5 megawatt mine, if you lose power to a mill at a 5 megawatt mine, it takes 4 hours to put that power back on. We talked about this just now. You said 7 days with furnaces. It's 4 to 5 hours for a small mine. So if you said that a power plant, a diesel-fired power plant, costs $200,000 a week for that mine, then you turn that power off. Well, actually, it's more efficient as a mining producer to produce gold with the diesel than to lose the power plant, than to lose the grid connection. So whilst I understand your protectionism towards Eskom and you egging Eskom on, especially, Mike's in a very difficult position there, but you have to be pragmatic, and you say, well, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to protect Eskom and the economy of South Africa, which actually we can't do? Or are you trying to increase the GDP and do what you are supposed to be doing, which is producing your metals and exporting your elements?
I think that almost gives a perfect sort of opportunity for me to wrap up. I think what both the sentiment and the discussion has been around. I don't think that anyone here is saying that we must protect Eskom at any costs. I think what we need to realize as a country is that failure of Eskom is in no way going to liberalize the market. In fact, it's probably going to be a hindrance to the liberalization of the market. So we do need we need someone who's going to be a strong grid operator. We need to protect pricing, which is directly related to the demand. And it's only if we have a strong grid that we can actually have a greater diversity of energy sources and different players in the market. So I think the protectionism or the paternal feelings we have up here for the Eskom relates primarily to that. One, we need that safety net to be able to extend and grow the grid and protect the existing infrastructure, because only then can we start looking at ways in which there can be diversity of suppliers and opportunities for that. I think the reality is that majority of us who are sitting as consumers have a concern around, are we going to ensure that we have adequate power? And if we're not looking at risk mitigation aspects from an Eskom supply perspective, then I think there are, you would have to ask yourself some hard questions. So I don't think anyone recognizes that we shouldn't be having risk mitigations and looking at alternative sources to supplement the Eskom power. But I think the long-term thing is we have to look at what the price and how do we make sure that we remain competitive both globally and both in the quality of supply, so that the rest of the world maintains us as customers or as suppliers of commodities and other products, and that the economy as a whole can take advantage of the next boom. So I want to thank the panel for their contribution, for making time, and for Mike for taking the pressure that I've put on him for his dual role that he doesn't get paid for. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Maxwell. Wanda, Funani, thank you very much.
Thanks. Can we give them a round of applause?